The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling riverside ranch as Andcapha Martinez stood on the wraparound porch, watching dust clouds rise from the main road. At 24, she had inherited more than just land from her late grandfather. She had inherited a legacy that made her one of the most sought-after women in 3 counties. The ranch stretched for miles, dotted with prize-winning cattle and oil wells that had made the Martinez family wealthy beyond measure. Andcapha brushed a strand of dark hair from her face as she counted the approaching vehicles. 12 different cars, trucks, and even one motorcycle were making their way up the long driveway. Word had spread quickly through the small town of Cedar Falls that she was finally ready to consider marriage proposals. The local newspaper had even run a story about the great courtship competition that was about to unfold. The first to arrive was Mayor Thompson's son, Richard, stepping out of his polished Mercedes wearing a 3-piece suit despite the Texas heat. Behind him came Dr. Bradley Harrison, the town's most eligible bachelor and heir to the Harrison medical dynasty. One by one they gathered on her front lawn like peacocks displaying their finest feathers. There was James Whitfield, whose family owned the largest bank in the county. Michael Torres, the star quarterback turned successful business owner. David Chen, a tech entrepreneur who had sold his company for millions. Each man represented wealth, status, and social standing that any woman in Cedar Falls would consider a perfect match. As the introductions began, Andcapha noticed how each suitor seemed more concerned with impressing the others than actually getting to know her. Richard boasted about his political connections while James flashed his platinum credit cards. Dr. Harrison spoke extensively about his medical achievements while Michael regaled everyone with stories of his football glory days. The competition had begun before she even realized it. Each man tried to outdo the others with grand gestures and expensive gifts. Richard arrived the next day with a diamond necklace worth more than most people's annual salary. James presented her with keys to a brand new Porsche. Dr. Harrison offered to name a wing of the new hospital after her, but something felt wrong to Andcapha. Despite their wealth and accomplishments, these men seemed to see her as a prize to be won, rather than a person to be loved. They spoke about her inheritance, her beauty, and her social status, but none of them asked about her dreams, her fears, or what truly made her happy. Days turned into weeks as the courtship intensified. The 12 suitors took turns planning elaborate dates and presenting increasingly expensive gifts. The whole town watched the spectacle with fascination, placing bets on who would ultimately win Andcapha's hand. Local businesses thrived as the wealthy suitors spent money freely, trying to impress their potential bride. Andcapha found herself feeling more isolated with each passing day. The pressure to choose was mounting, and her own family was pushing her toward the most suitable candidates. Her aunt favored Dr. Harrison for his medical prestige, while her cousin insisted that Richard's political connections would benefit the entire family. Meanwhile, the suitors grew more competitive and desperate. Arguments broke out between them over who had the right to escort Andcapha to various social events. James accused Michael of trying to sabotage his chances, while David hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Richard's family. The friendly competition had turned into something ugly and possessive. Through it all, Andcapha watched and waited, hoping that one of these men would show her genuine love and understanding. But as the days passed, she realized that she was seeing the worst of human nature: greed, jealousy, and the belief that everything, including love, could be bought with enough money and influence. Little did she know that her life was about to change completely when a quiet cowboy, working on a neighboring ranch, would enter the picture and challenge everything she thought she knew about love and what truly mattered in life. The old pickup truck rattled down the dusty road as Jake Sullivan finished his shift at the neighboring Crescent Moon Ranch. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel as he passed the Martinez property, where he could see the usual circus of expensive cars parked outside the main house. Jake had heard all about the 12 suitors competing for Andcapha's attention, but he kept his thoughts to himself. At 26, Jake owned nothing more than his truck, his horse, and the small cabin he rented from his employer. He had worked ranches across 3 states, saving every penny he could while learning everything there was to know about cattle, horses, and the land. Unlike the flashy suitors pursuing Andcapha, Jake understood the value of hard work and honest living. The next morning brought an unexpected crisis to the Martinez ranch. A section of fence had collapsed during the night storm, and several prize bulls had wandered onto the adjacent property. Andcapha's foreman was out of town, and none of the 12 suitors knew the first thing about handling livestock. Panic spread through the household as they realized the bulls could be injured or lost entirely. Jake was mending fences on his own ranch when he heard the commotion. Without hesitation, he saddled his horse and rode over to help. While the suitors stood around in their expensive clothes arguing about who should call for professional help, Jake was already in action. He moved with quiet confidence, using his skills to safely guide the bulls back to their proper pasture. Andcapha watched from a distance as this unknown cowboy worked with a grace and competence that none of her wealthy suitors possessed. She had never seen someone handle animals with such natural ability and respect. When Jake finally approached the house to report that all the cattle were secure, she felt something stir in her heart that had been missing throughout all the elaborate courtship displays. Their conversation was brief but meaningful. Jake tipped his hat respectfully and explained what had happened with the fence, suggesting some improvements that could prevent future problems. His voice was calm and genuine, without any of the artificial charm or calculated flattery she had grown accustomed to hearing. When she thanked him for his help, he simply nodded and said it was the neighborly thing to do. The 12 suitors barely acknowledged Jake's contribution, dismissing him as just another ranch hand. Richard Thompson actually made a snide comment about hired help knowing their place, which made Andcapha's eyes flash with anger. She found herself defending Jake's actions while the suitors quickly changed the subject back to their own accomplishments. Over the following days, Andcapha found excuses to visit the areas of her ranch that bordered Jake's workplace. She told herself she was just checking on the fence repairs, but deep down, she hoped to encounter the quiet cowboy again. Their paths crossed several times, and each brief conversation revealed more about Jake's character. Unlike her other suitors, Jake never tried to impress her with stories of wealth or status. Instead, he shared his knowledge about the land, his love for the animals he worked with, and his simple philosophy about treating all living things with respect. He spoke about his dreams of someday owning his own small ranch, not for profit or prestige, but because he believed in the honest satisfaction of working the land. These conversations began to highlight the stark contrast between Jake and the 12 suitors. While they competed for her attention with increasingly expensive gestures, Jake seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. He asked about her experiences managing the ranch, listened to her concerns about preserving her grandfather's legacy, and offered practical advice without any expectation of reward. The suitors noticed Andcapha's frequent absences and began to grow suspicious. Dr. Harrison hired a private investigator to follow her, while James Whitfield started questioning the ranch staff about her activities. Their possessive behavior only served to push Andcapha further away, making her realize that these men saw her as property to be owned rather than a partner to be cherished. Meanwhile, Jake remained unaware of the growing attention from both Andcapha and her suspicious suitors. He continued his daily work with the same dedication and integrity that had always defined his character, never imagining that his simple acts of kindness and competence were winning the heart of the woman every wealthy man in the county was desperate to marry. The annual Cedar Falls Cattle Show was the biggest event of the year, drawing ranchers and visitors from across the state. The Martinez Ranch had always been a major participant, and this year carried extra significance as everyone expected Andcapha to announce her choice of husband at the celebration. The 12 suitors had been preparing for weeks, each planning elaborate ways to propose during the festivities. Jake arrived at the show with his employer's modest entry, a few head of well-trained cattle that represented honest ranch work rather than expensive breeding programs. He wore his cleanest jeans and his one good shirt, a stark contrast to the designer outfits and custom boots worn by Andcapha's suitors. Most people barely noticed him as he went about his work, focusing instead on the drama surrounding the wealthy competition for the Martinez. The first day of the show brought disaster when a sudden thunderstorm spooked the animals and sent them scattering across the fairgrounds. Panic erupted as expensive prize cattle ran loose among the crowds of visitors. The 12 suitors stood helplessly by as chaos unfolded around them, more concerned with protecting their expensive clothes than helping with the emergency. Jake sprang into action without hesitation. He coordinated with other experienced ranchers to safely contain the frightened animals, working for hours in the pouring rain and mud. His knowledge and leadership helped prevent injuries to both people and livestock, turning what could have been a tragedy into a manageable situation. While others complained about ruined outfits and missed opportunities, Jake focused entirely on the task at hand. Andcapha watched this unfold from the judging pavilion, seeing clearly how Jake's character shone through in crisis while her wealthy suitors revealed their true priorities. When the emergency was over and Jake finally stopped to catch his breath, she approached him with a warm towel and a cup of hot coffee. Their eyes met for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, and both felt something powerful and undeniable pass between them. Their conversation that evening was different from all the others. Away from the crowds and the watching eyes of her suitors, Andcapha and Jake talked honestly about their hopes and dreams. She spoke about the pressure she felt to marry for social expectations rather than love, while he shared his struggles to build a life based on his own values rather than inherited wealth. They discovered a connection that went far deeper than anything she had experienced with her other suitors. The second day of the show brought the traditional competitions, and Jake surprised everyone by entering the bronc riding contest. Despite lacking the fancy equipment and sponsorships of other contestants, his natural skill and years of working with difficult horses made him a formidable competitor. He rode with a quiet intensity that impressed even the most experienced cowboys in attendance. Meanwhile, the 12 suitors were growing increasingly desperate as they sensed Andcapha's attention shifting away from them. Richard Thompson organized an expensive dinner at the town's fanciest restaurant, complete with a live orchestra and imported champagne. Dr. Harrison arranged for a helicopter to spell out "Marry Me" in the sky above the fairgrounds. Each gesture seemed more elaborate and desperate than the last, but Andcapha found herself making excuses to avoid these grand displays, instead seeking out quiet moments to watch Jake work with the horses or help other ranchers with their animals. She began to understand that real strength came not from wealth or status, but from character and the willingness to help others without expecting anything in return. The competition among the 12 suitors reached a boiling point when they discovered Jake's growing influence on Andcapha's thoughts and feelings. James Whitfield confronted Jake directly, offering him money to leave town immediately. When Jake politely refused, several of the suitors began spreading rumors about his background and questioning his motives for befriending their intended bride. Jake faced this hostility with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. He never responded to their insults or defended himself against their accusations. Instead, he continued to treat everyone with respect while focusing on his work and his growing friendship with Andcapha. This response only served to highlight the difference between his character and that of his accusers. As the final day of the cattle show approached, tension filled the air like electricity before a storm. Everyone knew that Andcapha would soon have to make her decision, and the entire town watched to see whether she would choose wealth and social standing or follow her heart towards something entirely different. The stage was set for a confrontation that would surprise everyone and change the course of multiple lives forever. The final night of the Cedar Falls Cattle Show arrived with an atmosphere of tension and anticipation that had the entire town buzzing with excitement. The 12 suitors had arranged for a grand finale celebration, complete with a live band, catered dinner, and elaborate decorations that transformed the fairgrounds into something resembling a movie set. Each man was convinced that this would be the moment when Andcapha would finally choose her husband from among them. Andcapha arrived at the celebration wearing a simple blue dress that complemented her natural beauty without the need for excessive jewelry or designer labels. The 12 suitors immediately surrounded her, each trying to claim the first dance and the honor of escorting her through the evening's festivities. She smiled politely, but felt increasingly trapped by their possessive attention and grand gestures. The evening began with speeches from each suitor, delivered from a makeshift stage in front of the assembled crowd. Richard Thompson spoke about his political ambitions and how Andcapha would make the perfect politician's wife. Dr. Harrison outlined his plans for expanding the hospital and how her family's donations would create a medical legacy. One by one, each man presented his vision of their future together, focusing heavily on wealth, status, and social position. Jake watched from the edge of the crowd, feeling completely out of place among the fancy decorations and expensive entertainment. He had only come because his employer insisted that all ranch hands attend the community celebration, but he felt like an intruder in this world of wealth and privilege. Several times he considered leaving, but something kept him rooted to the spot, watching as Andcapha endured speech after speech from men who seemed to know everything about her inheritance and nothing about her heart. As the evening progressed, the suitors became more aggressive in their competition. James Whitfield publicly announced his intention to build Andcapha a mansion that would rival anything in Dallas. Michael Torres revealed plans for a honeymoon that would take them around the world in a private jet. David Chen presented her with a business proposal that would merge their fortunes and create a technology empire. The turning point came when Dr. Harrison made his final pitch to the crowd, speaking as if Andcapha's acceptance was already a foregone conclusion. He outlined their future children's education at the finest schools, their membership in exclusive country clubs, and their position among the social elite of Texas. The crowd applauded enthusiastically, but Andcapha felt her heart sinking with each word that reduced her to nothing more than an accessory to someone else's ambitions. Unable to bear another moment of being treated like a prize in a contest, Andcapha stepped away from the stage and walked toward the quieter area where the horses were stabled. She needed space to think and breathe, away from the suffocating attention of men who saw her as a means to enhance their own status, rather than as a person worthy of genuine love and respect. Jake noticed her departure and, after a moment's hesitation, followed at a respectful distance. He found her standing beside his horse, gently stroking the animal's neck while tears glistened in her eyes. For the first time since the courtship began, Andcapha looked vulnerable and uncertain, nothing like the confident heiress everyone assumed her to be. Their conversation that night changed everything. Away from the crowds and the pressure, Andcapha spoke honestly about her fears of being trapped in a loveless marriage for the sake of social expectations. She talked about her grandfather's teachings, his belief that true wealth came from integrity and hard work, rather than inherited money. Jake listened without judgment, offering comfort through his presence rather than empty promises or grand gestures. When Jake finally spoke, his words were simple but profound. He told her that every person deserved to be loved for who they were, not what they owned. He shared stories about couples he had known who found happiness in modest circumstances, building their lives on mutual respect and shared values rather than social status and material wealth. As they talked, the sounds of the celebration continued in the distance, but both felt as if they existed in a separate world where honesty and genuine connection mattered more than public approval. For the first time in months, Andcapha felt truly understood and valued as a person, rather than as a symbol of wealth and social standing. The evening ended with Jake walking Andcapha back toward the main celebration, both knowing that something fundamental had shifted between them. The 12 suitors were still waiting, still confident in their various advantages and still completely unaware that their greatest competition came not from each other, but from a quiet cowboy who offered something none of them could buy or manufacture. The morning after the cattle show celebration brought an unexpected crisis that would test everyone's true character. A fire had broken out in the old barn on the Martinez property, threatening not only the building but also the valuable horses kept there. The alarm was raised just as dawn was breaking, and by the time help arrived, flames were already consuming one corner of the structure. The 12 suitors, who had spent the night at various hotels in town, arrived at the scene still dressed in their expensive clothes from the previous evening's festivities. They stood at a safe distance, making phone calls to their insurance agents and lawyers, while expressing concern about the property damage and its effect on Andcapha's net worth. None of them made any move to actually help with the emergency unfolding before their eyes. Jake had been up early, preparing for another day of work when he saw the smoke rising from the Martinez ranch. Without hesitation, he drove his truck toward the fire, arriving even before the volunteer fire department. While others stood around discussing the situation, Jake was already organizing an effort to evacuate the terrified horses from the burning barn. The rescue operation was dangerous and required someone with extensive knowledge of horse behavior and movement. Jake worked systematically, entering the smoke-filled barn repeatedly to lead each animal to safety. His calm demeanor and confident handling kept the horses from panicking. preventing injuries that could have occurred if the evacuation had been handled poorly. Andcapha arrived at the scene in time to witness Jake's heroic efforts. She watched as he risked his own safety to save her animals, asking for nothing in return except the assistance of anyone willing to help. Several ranch hands from neighboring properties joined the effort, but none of the 12 suitors volunteered to get their hands dirty or risk their expensive clothing. When the fire department finally arrived and took control of the situation, Jake had successfully evacuated all 15 horses from the barn. His clothes were singed, his face was covered with soot, and his hands showed burns from handling hot metal latches. But every animal was safe and accounted for. The barn was a total loss, but the lives of the valuable horses had been preserved through Jake's quick thinking and selfless actions. The contrast between Jake's behavior and that of her 12 suitors was impossible for Andcapha to ignore. While they had focused on protecting their own interests and maintaining their appearance, Jake had risked everything to help someone else without expecting any reward or recognition. The difference in character was so stark that it made her previous months of indecision seem almost foolish. Later that day, as the cleanup began and insurance adjusters surveyed the damage, Andcapha found Jake tending to his burns with basic first aid supplies. She insisted on driving him to Dr. Harrison's clinic for proper medical treatment, creating an awkward situation when they encountered the doctor who was one of her persistent suitors. Dr. Harrison treated Jake's injuries professionally but coldly, making several comments about the foolishness of rushing into dangerous situations without proper training or equipment. His attitude revealed a petty jealousy that Andcapha found deeply unattractive, especially when contrasted with Jake's quiet acceptance of both the praise and criticism he received for his actions. The fire incident became the talk of the town, with different people drawing different conclusions about what had happened. Some praised Jake as a hero, while others, influenced by the 12 suitors, suggested that he had staged the rescue to impress Andcapha. The rumors and gossip created an uncomfortable atmosphere that forced both Andcapha and Jake to confront their growing feelings for each other. That evening, Andcapha made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She invited Jake to dinner at her house not as part of any competition or public display, but as a private expression of gratitude and growing affection. The invitation sent shockwaves through the community and infuriated the 12 suitors, who saw it as a betrayal of the unspoken rules governing their courtship competition. The dinner was simple but meaningful, prepared by Andcapha herself rather than by servants or caterers. They talked about their hopes for the future, their shared love of the land and animals, and their belief that genuine happiness came from honest relationships rather than social status. For the first time since inheriting her grandfather's fortune, Andcapha felt like herself rather than like a prize to be won. The evening ended with both of them acknowledging that something special was developing between them, despite the obstacles created by their different social positions and the expectations of others. They agreed to continue seeing each other, knowing that their relationship would face opposition from family members, social peers, and especially from the 12 increasingly desperate suitors who had invested so much time and money in their pursuit of the Martinez fortune. The confrontation that everyone had been anticipating finally arrived on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in late summer. The 12 suitors had demanded a final meeting with Andcapha, insisting that she make her choice immediately and end the uncertainty that had been consuming the entire community for months. They gathered at the Martinez ranch with the confidence of men who believed that wealth and social position would ultimately triumph over any temporary infatuation. Andcapha faced them on the front porch of her grandfather's house, the same spot where she had first watched them arrive with their expensive cars and elaborate courtship plans. But now everything was different. She stood there not as a confused young woman overwhelmed by attention, but as someone who had discovered what truly mattered in life and love. The 12 suitors took turns making their final appeals, each one more desperate and demanding than the last. Richard Thompson spoke about the political dynasty they could build together, emphasizing how their marriage would benefit both their families for generations. Dr. Harrison outlined the medical empire they could create, complete with hospitals and research facilities, bearing their combined names. James Whitfield presented detailed financial projections showing how their merged assets would make them one of the wealthiest couples in Texas. Michael Torres promised a life of luxury travel and exclusive social events that would established them among the international elite. One by one, each man painted a picture of material success and social triumph that any reasonable woman should find irresistible. But as they spoke, Andcapha noticed how none of them mentioned love, companionship, or genuine partnership. They talked about her beauty as an asset, her inheritance as a business opportunity, and her family name as a social advantage. Not one of them spoke about her thoughts, her dreams, or her value as a human being independent of her material wealth. When they finished their presentations, the suitors stood expectantly, clearly confident that she would choose one of them. After all, what rational woman would reject security, status, and luxury for an uncertain future with a man who owned nothing but his integrity and work ethic? They had convinced themselves that their competition was only with each other, never imagining that someone outside their social circle could pose a serious threat. Andcapha's response shocked them all into stunned silence. She thanked them for their attention and their offers, acknowledging the advantages that marriage to any of them would provide. But then she explained that she had learned something important about herself and about love during the months of their courtship. She had discovered that genuine happiness could not be purchased or negotiated, and that true partnership required mutual respect and understanding rather than financial compatibility. The revelation that she was choosing Jake Sullivan over all of them sent the 12 suitors into a state of disbelief and rage. They accused her of temporary madness, suggesting that she had been manipulated by a fortune hunter who was obviously after her money. Several of them threatened to expose Jake's true motives and protect her from what they insisted was a terrible mistake. But Andcapha stood firm in her decision, explaining that Jake had never asked her for anything and had repeatedly demonstrated his character through actions rather than words. She pointed out that while they had competed for her attention with expensive gifts and grand gestures, Jake had simply been himself, honest, hardworking, and genuinely caring about her well-being rather than her bank account. The scene that followed was ugly and revealing. The wealthy suitors showed their true colors as they hurled insults and threats, their polished facades cracking under the pressure of rejection. Some demanded compensation for the time and money they had invested in courting her. Others threatened social and business retaliation against both Andcapha and Jake. Jake himself had been working nearby and arrived in time to witness the confrontation. He said nothing as the 12 men vented their fury, maintaining his characteristic dignity even as they questioned his motives and attacked his character. His calm response to their hostility only served to highlight the difference between his genuine character and their entitled arrogance. When the dust settled and the suitors had finally departed, making various threats and promises of revenge, Andcapha and Jake stood together on the porch where the whole drama had begun. The wealth and status that had once seemed so important now felt like burdens compared to the simple joy of being with someone who valued her for who she truly was. Their wedding 6 months later was a small, simple ceremony attended by friends who understood that real love was worth more than social approval or material advantage. While the 12 rejected suitors nursed their wounded pride and eventually found other wealthy women to pursue, Andcapha and Jake built a life together based on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that true wealth came from the richness of their relationship rather than the size of their bank account. Years later, as they worked side by side on the ranch that they managed together, both knew that Andcapha had made the right choice. She had shocked everyone by choosing love over luxury, character over cash, and genuine partnership over social position. In doing so, she had found a happiness that no amount of money could have purchased and a love that no social status could have guaranteed.